Welcome to this series, Acute Dispute and Underlying Conflict, co-hosted by JAMS and the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. My name is Isabel Phillips. I'm Director of ADR and Mediation Development at the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. In terms of my practice experience, I've straddled the commercial and political, and I'm a conflict specialist in international conflict in fragile and violent contexts, and a mediator, trainer, and consultant. Previously working for CEDA before I joined the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators and also various other organisations, including the Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit. And I'm going to be moderating this webinar together with my colleague Ranse Howell from JAMS. Just a couple of housekeeping points. Please note that the seminar is going to be recorded and will be made available to you online if you're an attendee to this seminar through YouTube after the seminar, probably about 24 hours afterwards. It's going to be 1 hour long, and after a short introduction, first from myself and then from Ranse, we'll have some thoughts from two speakers, Michael McIlwrath and Shelia Bates. And we'll then have some discussion followed by Q&A, both from each other and also hopefully from you too. So please do start adding questions in the question and Q&A tool at any point during the session. If you have general discussion or technical problems, please use the chat function so that we can help you out with that. So a few words of introduction. So this is the first of the Acute Dispute webinar series, and I want to give you just a few words about one of the ideas behind it. So we're in a situation where there's the first full-scale interstate armed conflict in Europe since World War II, and that's resulted in a bunch of geopolitical shifts and re-evaluation. And because of the ramifications of these developments, the two different worlds of conflict resolution and alternative dispute resolution have been thrown into relief in quite an interesting way. To illustrate what I mean by this, I'm going to quote John Burton Weir. If you've from a conflict resolution background, you've probably heard of him. If you're from an ADR background, you may well not have done. And he commented back in the 90s, ADR typically lacks any analytical process. Frequently, it makes no distinction between disputes and conflicts, and it tends to apply existing legal norms in this more informal way. So this might be quite contentious, particularly in an ADR context, to hear those words. But for those directly affected by conflict, those dealing with disputes and arising directly and indirectly out of the conflict situation, as parties, representatives, or dispute resolvers, or conflict specialists, these differences are maybe important. The difference between conflict and dispute. Why? Because clarity around what we can and can't resolve, depending on structures, tools, and contexts we're operating in, and what needs more fundamental transformational change in the way that things are done is important. And without differentiating these two things, it can cause confusion and frustration. So within this series, what we're trying to do is looking at the disputes level without ignoring, but differentiating issues of underlying conflicts requiring fundamental and transformational constructive engagement, constructive conflict engagement. And these include the profound challenges of our time, the climate crisis and sustainability, public health crisis as highlighted by COVID around the world, and the issues of diversity and inclusion, which are global issues in many different ways. So that's one of the thoughts behind this, looking at these acute disputes that we across the world are dealing with, coming out of a very profound conflict, underlying conflict. And with that, I would like to welcome you to the first in this series, which is titled Commercial Stability in a World of Conflict, Effective Dispute Management in Uncertain Times. And I'd just like to say a few words about, firstly, my co-moderator, Ranse Howell, and then the other two speakers. So Ranse is the Director of International Operations at JAMS, ADR. He's an expert in negotiation and dispute resolution consultancy with previous work with CEDA and clients including the EIB, the EBRD, and UNHCR. He holds a PhD, a JD, and is also an adjunct professor at both Pepperdine and Westminster universities. And he's joined by Shelia Bates, who is based in France, a highly experienced CEDA accredited mediator, board member and trainer. She's also a conflict coach and facilitator. Her background is in FTSE and Fortune quoted companies as well as IFIs, and has particular interest and expertise in international disputes relating to human rights law, labour law, and facilitating dialogue in supply chain management to remedy modern day slavery, which is of particular interest maybe today. McIlwrath is based in Italy. He has 22 years of lead in-house litigation roles for the General Electric Oil and Gas Division, and is now VP of litigation for Baker Hughes. Oh, I'm getting please correct me, Michael.
I left. I was until last year. Now I have my own company, but I was vice president of litigation of Baker Hughes.
Sorry, apologies. Yeah, founded your own company in Disputes, SRL, and is also, alongside running your own company, chair of the ICC's governing body for DR services and adjunct professor for the Bocconi Law School in Milan. So with those introductions, I'd like to hand over to Ranse to introduce the structure of the session.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and it is really a pleasure to present some of our thoughts, and also work with my former colleague, Isabel Phillips, who we spent many years working together at CEDA. And the partnership that we formed with the Chartered Institute is very valuable. And also two colleagues on the screen, Shelia Bates and Michael McIlwrath, who I've known for many years and also admired their work and also their passion and their dedication to not only presenting the best in dispute resolution, but looking for alternative ways. What I hope to do today, and what we hope to do, is to sort of present a framework and present sort of a stage as to why we're having these conversations and why it's important to have these conversations right now, as opposed to waiting. And there are many similarities to what we sort of saw 2 years ago. And I'm going to share my screen as we love to do. Here we go. And here I am. There's two of me. Isn't that disturbing? There's me at the top and me here. So when we started to look at some of the challenges and the things that were emerging out of the conflict that was emerging in between Russia and Ukraine, many of the cascading issues were very similar to those that we first faced when we first started to look at the situation with COVID. We said, this seems sort of familiar, but we've never seen anything like this before. So what do we do? So it's a bit like standing in front of a maze. You're kind of standing there, shall I go left or right? And so what we hope to do is sort of pull back a bit and give you almost a route map and some form of a direction to say, yes, it might still be somewhat of a challenge, but if you have a direction and you understand where you need to travel, then you have the comfort and the knowledge that you will get there successfully. And for those of you who've ever been in a maze, even if you have the map, the route map, it's still a bit sort of confusing. And I'm a short person, so that also causes a bit of an issue as well. And so 2 years ago, we started doing some thinking, and there was some information that was published in The Economist, really about the kind of the supply chain dynamics. So if there was a supply chain challenge in China, where would people have to shift? Where would things be available? I know that Shelia and Michael are going to be speaking to that. And I think that the conversation over the past few years is really looking at supply chain resiliency and also the fragility of supply chains. We also then started to write about really managing business relationships as we started to sort of see the fallout. And the same thing is true as now. You want to consider what will be some of the cascading disputes that will emerge. And they might not even necessarily be readily apparent, but just knowing what you've seen in the past, you can say, these are some of the things that we'll experience. We at JAMS we put together a working group and really pulled together a panel of experts to say, what have you seen in the past? What are you going to be seeing in the future? And how different is this from what you've seen, and how similar? And I think using that thinking and using that approach really helps to guide us. And so what we're going to do is just present really a kind of a very brief and quite an easy and straightforward framework, because this is the same sort of thing you would consider whenever you would have something that would cause either a challenge, a disruption, or a difficulty, which is really to identify what the triggering effect or the conflict is. Where is this located? Is it something that's regional? Is it national, or is it international? Of course, that has an impact on the dynamics and who the stakeholders you might want to include. Who are the parties involved? Are they individuals? Are they institutional? Are they government? And again, for those of you who worked with governments and regulatory bodies, you understand the complexity that will lead. Why would you be interested in doing it now? Why not wait? Because I've often heard, well, there are no disputes emerging, so we're okay. And then, of course, you do the question of, to ignore it would cost what? It would mean what? And potentially there's a lost opportunity. And then, of course, last but not least, when you're doing your sort of analysis, is it a short, medium, or long-term intervention? And sometimes you don't really know that until you start. But often what I've seen is people do parallel types of, or parallel initiatives. So therefore things are working alongside each other, but they have a short, medium, and long-term impact and effect. And I think just sort of giving that sort of framework, it helps individuals to understand that there are many, many different situations and circumstances. They don't have to be as globally challenging and as impactful as, say, COVID or the one we currently see at the moment. But there are certainly things that are happening all the time, and that we kind of scratch our head and say, oh, how is this similar? How is this different? Many of them have very, very much the same DNA. And so just to give a quick sort of macro view, the what here is the current situation that we're experiencing in Russia, and really what will happen as far as, say, restrictions on oil and gas. And of course, the negative views of not only Russian businesses, but Russian individuals. And people have seen that across the world, that people are having some of this challenge. And of course, where is the intervention going to be? Where is it located? Yes, it's located in some part of Central Europe, and many people might say, well, that's not really going to affect me. But as Shelia and Michael are going to say, well, it will affect you because ... because of the supply chain, because of the various different rare earth metals that are being mined, and also because of the grain that has usually come from that part of the region. Who's involved? Is it government sanctions initially are the initial trigger, then companies are involved. Why would you want to intervene? Because if you don't intervene now, then should you wait? There is, of course, the reputational risk and a whole bunch of other things that you have to navigate. And of course, there is also a thing about business uncertainty. And of course, the question is, when should you intervene? Should you do it now, or should you wait? And this is just sort of a very brief introduction as to sort of analysis that you might want to do. Just a very quick sort of bit of snapshot as to changing views. Baker McKenzie produced a very useful report at the beginning of 2022, and they said, what would be some of the greatest challenges or the external factors that would provide an increase in exposure to disputes? And at the beginning of the year, it was COVID, as you can see from the top. We asked the same question last month at the event in California at the USC JAMS Symposium. And you see now with 21% of respondents said it was geopolitical issues. And so you can see the frame has quickly changed to what people didn't necessarily think is an important issue, but has certainly risen to something that people are considering. So what we've done here is consider, for those who are interested in insurance, what sort of insurance do you kind of consider? When do you make a claim? And how do you make a claim? Here are some additional examples. there has been a very useful ongoing addition to lots of additional resources. These will be made available. And law.com has done a fantastic job as compiling a list of articles that are relevant for those who want some further information. That's sort of my brief sort of overview and, and sort of setting the scene as to why we're having this conversation and why now, why we've invited these fantastic individuals and why we're going to be continuing the conversation. So, Isabel, I think that Shelia will be providing.
Thank you. Yes, Shelia, can I invite you to take the floor, or the virtual screen more accurately at this point?
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here to meet you all, and thanks for setting the scene, both Isabel and Ranse. What I thought might be helpful to do was to take you quite quickly through sort of Rance's framework with respect to the supply chain network and broader business. So really, I'm going to go straight into it, onto slide 2, if I may, please, and just think about, in the context of the world that we live in today, well, what is triggering the difficulties and disputes and or conflict, taking good note of Isabel's differentiation between the two in the world today. And of course, Ukraine and the Russian invasion of it is a big factor. But I think that for most people in industry, COVID-19, climate change, business and human rights, other regions of conflict are there. And it's interesting to note, just thinking about, other regions of conflict, in some of the work that I've been doing in the last couple of years, for example, we now have a, critical situation in Ukraine, and that will have an impact on food security and cost and prices, etc. But also think about other countries where, for example, in Myanmar, where there's disputes and conflict going on, and how a very good dispute resolution process that had been put in place was no longer able to function because of the war. So that really had a very direct impact on the ability to people in dispute to be able to resolve their situations with big ready-to-wear brands, as it happened. Another area is in Africa, in Guinea, where there was also war going on, and that also had a particular impact on a dispute that I was working on, in terms of how do you deal with the impact of COVID and a war and a dispute between workers and their employer. So all of this is going on all the time, but we just seem to have one thing heaped on top of the other at the moment. And in terms of where this dispute is, where is this going on? Well, if we want to focus on Ukraine, well, that's a starting point. There's a pretty much knock-on effect everywhere with respect to how you handle disputes and conflict. And we've already seen across the Western world, across Europe, that the impact on food security and rising costs has been spoken about a lot already, and we're not very far into the current situation with Russia and Ukraine. So what I think is probably interesting for businesses, and I was just looking at the list of attendees, and I see that there are a lot of you who are involved in contract work and putting together contracts and dealing with supply chains. And I kind of thought, well, you all have a huge bunch of stakeholders. Your stakeholders are first and foremost, obviously, your clients, but also your suppliers. How are things for them? And how is the impact of everything that's going on in the world affecting them and their ability to work with you, to deliver what you need? What are their pressures? And of course, we talk about supply chains, but I think probably supply web is a much better word, because it's much more complex than just a chain up and down. Your workers and leaders. I've had an experience recently trying to buy something from a very well-known brand, and it has taken 5 or 6 various visits to try and get what they're meant to be delivered and installed. And that's has a huge impact on the workers because it's a waste of time for them rocking up and not being able to do their job. It's really difficult for them where they have clients that are unhappy. And so there's a dispute arising straight away because the shortages in the supply chain, delivery issues mean that there are lots of unhappy clients. And very often you find that the workers are neither empowered or trained to handle those situations. What about your advisors, the banks and the other funders? We know there's a lot of pressure on ESG and corporate and social responsibility these days. It's really beginning to have an impact with bankers and investors. And then, of course, governments and policymakers. Governments are great. They are, good at governing countries in principle, but they are slow to act and policies are slow to be put in place. And probably some of you are already feeling this in terms of, do you have the adequate room to maneuver in this fast changing marketplace? And then, of course, there's civil society. And I think there's a lot of pressure now in terms of Black Lives Matter, Me Too, business and human rights, ethical trading, and all these factors. And why is it important? Well, for your business continuity. Food security is really something that people are concerned about, and I'm sure that's something that is quite familiar to many people on this seminar today. And of course, you've got the rising costs, the war for talent. There's going to be a massive issue in terms of having enough talent to do all the things that need to be done. What are the contractual arrangements do you have? Have you written into that what's needed in the current very volatile scenario? Again, what are your ethical and business and human rights approach? How is this going to impact people trafficking? Is there going to be more of it as there is a shortage of staff and people are desperate, on the other hand, for work? And what's going to happen to people's corporate values? This is something that's really been challenged, and we've seen it already with particular respect to Ukraine and Russia. And this is something that I think will be really interesting to see, is how willing and how able are businesses to take a principled stand in the face of conflicts and behaviors which they find distasteful, and how will they handle that? And when? I think it's all happening now, and I think it's going to be with us for this foreseeable future. So a couple of things really I think it would be useful to consider. I've probably touched on some of them already, so if I could just have the next slide, that would be really great. Thank you. So first of all, what's your risk? And probably a lot of you already are stuck looking at that or have been looking at it. And if you haven't, you certainly will be soon. And the first thing is, in terms of your systems, your processes and your practices, is your business fit for purpose in this rocky, volatile world? What does need to change and when? And what resources do you have to hand? And what are your constraints and your people risk? You think about burnout and lack of skills and lack of training. At the end of the day, this can be a very important factor. And then what strategies do you have for mitigation in place? Well, we've all learned a lot in the last 2 years, that's for sure. And I think that that is really going to help us in the months and years to come. In terms of your mitigation of disputes, what inbuilt and dynamic preventive mechanisms do you have? Have you got any? And are those mechanisms, are they rapid? Are they flexible? And are they looking forward and not backwards, so that we can continue to do business and to thrive in these very uncertain and volatile times? So that's kind of just setting the scene from my side, and I'm going to hand over now to Isabel, who will introduce, I think, the next person. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Sheila. It's a really fascinating insight. And those last two questions will ponder on what's your risk and what's your mitigation. And at this point, I'd like to hand over to Michael, who's going to talk to us a little about some of the other ramifications, including energy, I think.
Yes, I will. Here we are. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to today's session, which, by the way, reminds me of some of the sessions that I used to have in the businesses that I worked in, where we would, periodically, just as a matter of routine, assess the risks, the game changers, and the things that we need to do to have mitigation plans in place, something you would consistently update all the time. And certainly that's no more pressing than right now. What I would like to do, building on what Sheila has now just said, is I'd like to talk a little bit about the energy sector, but I'd like to have a prologue about, do you see my screen okay, by the way, Isabel?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I'd like to talk a bit about how not to plan for a crisis, for an emergency. And the example I would give is the EU versus AstraZeneca litigation. So during the COVID crisis, there were a lot of supply contracts for the purchase of vaccines, which of course became a vital, a fundamental solution or partial solution to the public health crisis nations were facing. What did the EU do? Well, the EU, which has long been a sponsor of alternative forms of collaboration and dispute resolution, they included courts of Brussels in their supply contract. It's public, so access. We also have access to the news about the litigation that was filed in the Brussels courts when there was a dispute over delays in the delivery of the vaccines. I raise this because I think that was poor planning. It was not thinking about, well, wait a minute, if there's going to be a problem with delivery, the public needs to get vaccines. Maybe going to court and tying things up for a long time and employing capital and dispute resolution isn't the optimal solution. So I'll turn back to this in a second and think, well, let's take what we've learned from the COVID situation and the vaccine purchases. Now think about what's going to happen with energy. The invasion of Ukraine, as you all know, will create credible disruption, including with respect to the supply of energy. And if we take just Europe, which is heavily dependent on Russian hydrocarbons, and there's news today about potentially stopping shipments of coal. Well, okay, you can't just turn things off. Europe needs energy. What does this mean in practical terms? In practical terms, it means there are going to be lots and lots of additional energy, new energy projects. I'll discuss a little bit about LNG, but it's not like you can just say, well, we'll just buy, gas from somewhere else and we'll bring it on ships. There needs to be infrastructure, there need to be projects for that. They need to move fast. These projects are not done overnight. There are lots of different sources of energy, but they have their lead times, starting with feasibility studies and implementation. There are a lot of uncertainties around the supply chains that are going to be used for these energy projects that will impact, and all of these may contribute to disputes. And of course, this doesn't go. The other crisis that we're facing doesn't go away, which is the climate change crisis. And we have to be cognizant of the efforts that are being done. We'll also work within those constraints and see what that will mean for us. And this is with Europe. It's global impact, because if you'll see you prioritize projects and materials and resources in one area, it's going to stress where those are being delivered in other places. It's going to, in terms of stakeholders, to use Sheila's terms, I think it's a good term, it's going to be lots of energy companies, governments, equipment and technology suppliers, and I think dispute institutions as well need to really think about the impact. Failure is going to be a problem. I mean, this is one where you can't fail, not just because of sanctions, but because of the need for energy independence and energy security is now a priority. And I think in terms of the timing, I would say it's starting now, because now is when contracts are being entered into. The disputes that are likely to arise will be probably 12 months or more longer from when these contracts are entered into. And I think we'll continue to see this over the next 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. There's a tail to when the contracts are entered into, when the disputes subsequently arise. Probably longer than that, but I think that's the crunch period that we're facing. If we go to the next slide, I'll just give you a quick illustration of how I think the disputes are going to be affected and why we should begin planning for them now. You'll have read in the news that the United States made a commitment to help Europe with respect to replacing Russian gas by committing the delivery of 15 billion cubic meters of additional LNG. that sounds fantastic, but there's a problem. One is that the United States doesn't have that much, they have gas, but export capacity. You need equipment. You need to freeze or liquefy the LNG to export it. You need terminals for that. Europe is already maxed out in terms of its import ability. So there's going to have to be a lot of construction on both ends of the ocean in order for that to happen. If we go to the next slide. In practical terms, what is this going to mean? We say, well, we'll just build more capacity. Well, yeah, but building capacity takes maybe a year and a half, for a small terminal. This is to give a practical example, a company that we've worked with recently called Gas and Heat, small company in Italy. They build LNG, they build small scale LNG terminals. And small scale, this by the way, is a small LNG plant. That's, right today, that's maybe 18 months to 24 months. That's going to have to go faster, and they're going to have to build a lot of them. And if we go to the next chart, we'll also need ships, by the way, that will transport those. So what are the disputes likely to be? Well, they're going to be an energy project execution, and there's going to be lots of causes. There are always disputes in all complex projects, but now it's going to be speed that will be stressing as well. There'll be also the problem of supply chain uncertainties with these. To give just one example, if we go to the next page, I'll just show you briefly. The nickel is a key component for building storage vessels, whether you're storing hydrogen or liquid natural gas or any type of potential energy that needs to be stored under pressure. Nickel is one of the key components. Well, nickel comes out of Russia and the Donbass region of the Ukraine, or a lot of the world's nickel comes out of those. And just look at the spike that we've seen in prices. If you had entered into a lump sum contract to deliver any type of energy facility, or not just energy facility, but anything that was using nickel before the war broke out, you're being heavily impacted now. And the contracts that had been entered into before may not be profitable today, and they may not even be capable of being performed if these have a substantial material impact on certain contracts. So just quickly to conclude, I think that we're going to see a lot of disputes. We're going to see disputes anyway, but I think that there will be a push in disputes, with a shortage of materials, a shortage of skills of manpower. By the way, I think the skilled manpower is also going to extend to dispute resolution professionals. I know a lot of people working in dispute resolution today are already very busy and maxed out. So I do think it's a time where people need to think of how do I resolve problems as opposed to just how do I conduct a dispute. If we go to the last page, and I'll just conclude here on this. What are the things that we should be thinking of doing? If I were in any company today that was remotely being impacted by what we're seeing is likely to happen in the energy markets. Well, right now is when, projects, I'm sure that feasibility studies, contracts are probably not yet being finalized. Some may, but these tend to have to be studied for a certain period. There's a permitting process that has to take place for a lot of energy projects. So I would be looking at, the contract terms and conditions, as Shelia said. Are you addressing the risks that you might see? If it's materials are a key component, you may need to have clauses for price escalation. You need to have clauses that address for constraints in your supply chain or variations in the supply chain. Let's not make the mistake of AstraZeneca. So this would be my epilogue here. Let's think of dispute resolution that also points to a degree of collaboration and not just mediation and finding amicable solutions, but let's think about emergency arbitration. Let's think about dispute boards. If we're in the courts, let's think about accessing expedited procedures to those courts that have them. I think it's a great time to be training people. I think teams that are going to be executing these projects need skills not just on the technical side, but also on the soft skills. How do you resolve problems? How do you negotiate disputes? And I think it's a time for governments and dispute institutions to also begin thinking about what more can be done in order for disputes to be part of the enabling aspect. In other words, let's think about how we can go fast so that disputes don't slow down projects. It's a little bit of the tail wagging the dog, but if we worry about doing things on a traditional timeline where it takes 2 to 3 years to build a project and they can get held up for 1 or 2 years because of disputes, that's not going to work for the emergencies that we're facing today. It's time to think about, well, how can disputes let's start at the end and think, how can you get them done fast so that you don't have the sorts of problems that will be holding them up and delaying their implementation? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I think that's a fascinating insight, and I think it ties up the two ends of the situation of looking at how to be able to move faster in dealing with disputes so that they don't hold things up. And that links nicely back to how do we address and constructively engage with conflict before it creates problems. And that part of that is thinking about what the disputes may arise from it. So, and I think what we've just had there is analysis. What's your risk? What's your mitigation? And what are the potential actions attached to mitigation? And the final thing I'd like to reinforce here is I think we've got quite a mixed audience of people from business and commerce, from law backgrounds, as in attorneys and representatives, but also lots of dispute resolution and conflict resolution specialists in the form of mediators, adjudicators, arbitrators. So I think all these questions are relevant to the whole of that, the demographic, whoever you are. And please do add questions in the Q&A that have come up as a result of these presentations. So I'd like to hand over to Ranse again to kick off the discussion.
Yeah, and thank you, Isabel. And what it just reminds me is that whilst this session is just an hour, we could actually spend days just kind of delving in and unpackaging, because it's almost as you unpeel the onion, you see there are more layers and more layers of complexity. And Shelia and Michael, thank you so much for providing really what I think is a very useful context. But thinking about this, what really have you learned over the past 2 years that will help businesses manage the disputes triggered by the current conflict and also potentially future conflicts? Shelia.
Well, I think probably one that's pretty obvious to all of us, but I think really is going to help is, of course, we're all actually fatigued by Zoom and Teams and everything else. And I think that in terms of dispute resolution, the use of technology really has come of age. And that's important because access is much broader than previously. So that will help faster routes to resolution. It also helps people have a greater sense of security when they're involved in a dispute. If they can actually deal with that dispute in an online process, that's often very comforting for people. They find it easier. So I think one of the other key things, and Michael had touched on it earlier, is also that you're training staff and workers to deal with some of the issues that arise in terms of skills shortages, in terms of supply shortages, and actually managing client expectations, because that is a whole new world. And Michael talks about them being soft skills, and they're commonly known as that, aren't they? Well, I think probably many of the mediators around and others involved in dispute resolution would say that they're the hard skills, they're the really tough ones. So I think training people to do that is really important. So that's what I think we've learned over the last couple of years from my perspective.
Thank you. And Michael?
I agree. I think one of the things that we've learned, Ranse, is that before the pandemic, dispute resolution, as you know very well, everybody knows, nobody wanted to change. Everything continued as it done for decades, if not, I mean, we're all working basically out of 18th century procedures, right? And then and I tried before to get people to use technology, as Shelia said, so we have the use of technology. What I think, though, is most remarkable about what has happened is how rapid change has occurred, and not just in the adoption of technology. We've also seen that the technology has enabled other changes. It's been a catalyst for changes. I just wrote a chapter for a book that'll be coming out on some of the consequences of the COVID situation. One of them is I call the rise of the case management, the rise of the midstream conference, or the case management 2 conference, where you now see arbitration, for example, deciding more likely to decide the disputes in bits. Like, you don't have to just do everything up with this big hearing at the end where everybody's going to meet in a hotel conference room in 3 years and decide the dispute. You might be able to decide key components in the first few months of the dispute. So I think that it's this flexibility that we're seeing, and I think that change is continuing, and we can expect that it will be down. I think it will see more adaptation as time passes.
So what I'm hearing really kind of are 3 T's. It's sort of technology, training, and time, which is the speeding up of time. And then we don't need to wait for a Wagner ring series type thing, but we can actually have small little arias or small sort of scenes to really sort of manage our disputes. In thinking that, the disputes that are emerging, that emerge out of COVID, are they similar to the sort of disputes that you're seeing now and you anticipate in the future, or are they different? Shelia?
I think that in some cases, what may have been considered an interim situation is actually now looking like, you know, it's a structural shift in the way of doing business. So I think that that's going to cause more disputes, because there is really going to be competition for a lot of resources, and so it's going to be a test of how we do business in terms of our business ethics, and there are going to be, you know, there are further demands upon us in terms of energy and climate change and business ethics. So I think, in fact, it's all been ratcheted up, and I think that that's going to put more pressure on business, and I think that there will likely be more disputes. So I'm not sure if it's different. I just think there's going to be more of it, and people definitely need help.
By the way, I think if I may, I think it's very different, Sheila. I think that COVID shut things down, right? The disputes that we saw out of COVID were force majeure. Does it apply? What's happening? Because the world was shutting down. We've now had a couple of years with all kinds of stimulus actions. Trillions of dollars have been injected into the market already. And now we're going to see a number of projects taking place to adapt and see how can you build, but you've got all these other constraints that are out there. So I think it's a fundamentally different situation that we're facing in terms of the problem and the disputes that are likely to arise out of it. And
I know that there are a couple of questions that have come in already. So Isabel, would you like to?
Yeah, I thought I'd just pick up because it relates directly to this point. One of the questions is, what do you see as the long-term effects of both the war and the pandemic on disputes in the course of their resolution? So there's a couple of views being exchanged there between Michael and Shelia. So maybe just to sort of draw that out just for a second to answer that question. So the long-term effects of the war and the pandemic on disputes and their resolution.
Well, I think in some respects, Michael, are not necessarily saying entirely different things. I think that perhaps, particularly in the energy business, I can see that's really changed and will change fundamentally. I think that there's a shift, that we're not going back to the way the world was before. And therefore, I think that all those stresses will continue. And we're going to just have to learn to get to grips with them. That's my sense. This is the world we're in. As people say, well, we are where we are. So we really will have to get to grips with what's happening, with all the complexities that that Michael has been mentioning specifically in the area of energy. So I don't know what you'd say, Michael.
Well, I agree. But I think COVID definitely has an impact. I think it's too soon to say what sort of, we're right at the beginning of the Ukraine crisis. I don't know in terms of feeling this sort of geopolitical impact, if it's going to change the nature of the disputes. I think if anything, it's just going to drive the need for speed, but that's something that the old system, I think, would have struggled to deal with. And now, because of the adaptability we've seen through COVID, I think that we're in a better position. That's why I said sort of a tail wagging the dog, where I think we can now look at disputes and say, hey, wait, you can go fast, right? You can actually do these, but don't think that it's going to take you 3 years to build this terminal. Maybe you could do it in 15 months. I mean, you're not going to do it in 2 days, but we're now part of, I think we now in dispute resolution have to see ourselves also in part of the enabling chain of getting things done.
Yeah.
I think just picking up that point, I think that's something that I've observed during the COVID time, which I think is going to continue to be similar. The sense of what previously would be told, you'd be told it was impossible because of time, suddenly becomes possible because it has to be irrelevant of time. So I think that for me is one of the similarities.
Well, that's a great point, Isabel. But now we know it is doable, right? You know, I think we're actually better. If anything, we're better positioned now to face this crisis because we've seen how adaptable, you know, the systems that we have are to the needs.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I think might be interesting, and it'll be interesting to see if it comes about or not, is to what extent we can learn from areas where there have been conflict, where, you know, there are many places in the world where conflict is ongoing. So, you know, maybe it would be really helpful for us to take advice and guidance from those people.
Yeah, and actually picking up on what you just sort of said, Shelia, you know, how important is it that businesses have proactive conversations in periods of uncertainty, potentially in trying to either anticipate or manage or prevent the conflict which will potentially arise?
I think it's essential, and I think that we've lived in a world where, you know, there's been a great premium on technical expertise, and that's not going to go away because we need all that technical expertise. Additionally, I think the capacity to bring your people with you in times of uncertainty and do what you can to empower them and support them so that they can deal with the practical realities of how they're going to have to deal with their customers in a different way, and how you know, how the relationship between suppliers and their customers will inevitably change. There'll be more risk sharing and perhaps more partnerships. So maybe there will be a slight difference in the power balance between customers and suppliers as a possibility.
So let me pick up one of the other questions from the chat here, which relates to what you're talking about sounding like, I quote, enterprise risk management, ERM. And is your sense that ERM has been inadequate or inept, or that it needs to be rebuilt to deal with a tougher world?
I mean, yes, it is enterprise risk. That's exactly what it is. And well, no, I mean, it depends on how rigorous you are in applying your EMM. You know, how robust, how good is your ERM process? So if you can't, you know, look, you go through these exercises where you try to anticipate every conceivable thing that might go wrong, right, with the business, cyber attacks and asteroid impact. Well, there's certain sort of earth killing moments where you go, well, there's not going to be, if the earth is killed, there's nothing we can do. But you try to think of every conceivable risk that might impact your business and what you might do to mitigate it. So I just think it's a question, David's right. It's an enterprise risk management. If you didn't think about this, go back and check your process.
Yeah. I think resilience is going to be a massive element, you know, helping people to be resilient, because we don't know what's around the corner. The last few years have proved that, but a core skill is being resilient.
And one thing that I'd also like to pick up on is, you know, putting my sort of social psychologist hat on, is how can we guide or kind of suggest a mechanism where individuals or organizations might not sort of respond emotionally to what is potentially quite a challenging geopolitical situation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Next.
I think, yeah, well, I think that I think that people are going to be tested, and perhaps maybe one's got more questions than answers. I think that leadership skills are going to be key, and I think we're going to see even more focus on that within organizations. And I think it's going to be, again, so important to take staff with you. I think that one of the challenges potentially could be the fact that we've lost some connectivity in the last couple of years. People are now returning to work. So what's that going to mean in terms of dealing with the crisis that's now on our doorstep, very near to us? So I think that there's going to be more shared risk taking. And I think that there's pressure, I think, on organizations to take a principled stance. And I think their values are going to be tested. So what's going to happen there? And how are they going to keep those emotions under control? So I think we just got to realize there will be a lot of emotion. And we all know that if you squash the emotion, you're not going very far. So we've got to deal with the emotion.
Doesn't go away, does it?
People, doesn't go away.
If you guys see that, I mean, to me, I don't know about the emotional element. I think you may get there the same way just by rationally thinking through what your risks are. I mean, by the way, I was thinking enterprise risk management, to David's point earlier. This is what you guys are doing with this type of seminar. This is literally enterprise risk management, kind of an open source for everybody. But I think, you know, as we think about sanctions and the impacts they're going to have, you can have an emotional reaction. I hate this. I hate what's going on. I'm going to get out of those countries. I'm not, you know, those are you can do that. But on the other hand, you may also look to the fact that sanctions are going to make it impossible for you to get paid. I know that there are companies, for example, that are not have contracts in, for example, in Russia for delivery. They're not shipping. I mean, they're risking breaching their contracts. It's not emotional reaction. That's because they know that if they ship, they won't be able to get paid because of the impact of sanctions on the international banking system, right? So I think, you know, you really kind of need to think down the several layers into how everything's going to be impacting your business, which I'm sure most businesses are trying to figure out right now.
Yeah. I just fire a couple of quick questions at Mike that have come in from the audience around whether you think that dispute boards are going to see increased use in energy projects in disputes as they come up rather than afterward. And also in terms of the GPC report, how do you propose getting lawyers who are not always so willing to change, I didn't say it, it's a question from somebody else, a board and a new paradigm of dispute resolution?
This is being provocative. So quickly to answer Paul, yes, I think there's a role. I think you're going to have to, we need new tools. We need tools to go fast. And the problem is that companies that are not familiar with dispute boards, which are typically used on very large projects where you have these sort of standing organisms. I give you an example of a small scale LNG. That's a plant that didn't cost $1 billion to build. That cost $35 million to build, right? And you could do lots of those. And maybe instead of going after lots of, $1 billion projects, you do lots of smaller projects because they're easier to scale. You can do more of them, and you get, energy and gas to where it's needed more often. You may need government intervention to make things like a dispute board viable for those types of projects, because the parties, and this kind of ties into Thomas, what he's saying, because the lawyers and their advisors may not be familiar. They need to be cajoled through that door to get them there in order for speed to occur.
Thank you. I think
both of us time.
Sorry, Ranse.
Yeah, and what sort of one other thing that I just sort of almost in closing, as you can see here, as we sort of delve down, this is the reason why this first session sort of sets the scene, and the other 3 sessions will really focus on the sort of the different areas of focus from a particular practice perspective. But sort of both Michael and Shelia, what is sort of your key takeaway thoughts or advice or guidance, or having had this conversation, you thought, you know what, this is something that you should consider, or hopefully there are no asteroids, because that would be really unfortunate.
Yeah.
That's a hard question. Can Shelia go first?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I'll go first. Well, I think that, in a way, expect the unexpected. And we've had a lot of the unexpected in the last couple of years. And it's challenged everybody. And I would say, how do you need to arm yourself to deal with that as individuals? Because at the end of the day, an organization is a group of individuals. And that, I think, is probably a big takeaway for all of us. And I think, again, trying to be proactive, but it's a way of life. It's not, so, a crisis is not an event, really. They're now becoming a series, aren't they? So I think it's get ready for the series. That's what I would say.
Having a chance to reflect, I agree completely with Shelia. And I would say that we're talking to the people who are on this call are obviously people who are engaged and thinking about the risks and are active in dispute resolution. So in a sense, it's preaching to the choir, but I would say that now is the time for you to be the leaders in the field, to use your influence so that the contracts that are being negotiated today will address those risks, right? And you're impressing on others the importance of doing that, not just because there's a need for your private contract, your commercial contract, but there's a public need at the same time to see all this happen on a very, very fast pace. So that would be my.
Yeah, and thank you, both of you. And just before I hand over to Isabel to give closing remarks, this also sort of really reminds us that we've talked a lot about resolution, but there's a huge amount about prevention and management. And this is that the role of mediator or arbitrator or dispute resolution professional can be used, and they have the skills and they have the knowledge to provide a framework, to provide a structure that might not necessarily look like something you're familiar with, but it provides the mechanisms that sort of needed for this particular situation, for this particular challenge at that particular time. And I think it's about flexibility and it's about education. And I know that JAMS and I know that Chartered Institute are certainly looking at a range of sort of opportunities to provide those sorts of interventions. It's been a pleasure having this conversation, and I look forward to many more future discussions. Isabel.
Thank you. Yeah, and to reinforce that point, all, in my experience, dispute and conflict resolution experts, whether they're mediators, arbitrators, adjudicators, or do other forms of ADR, CR, and conflict management, are usually area expertise, area experts in some given area. And I'd just like to sort of enforce the point around the idea of enterprise risk management, that of course, if you were talking to public health experts before COVID, they were saying this is going to happen. This is going to happen very soon. And people asked me, as in terms of my specialism, oh, isn't it awful what's happening in relation to the Russia-Ukraine situation? I said, sadly, it's not hugely surprising. And I think as a field, we have huge amounts of expertise that is there and ready to be drawn on if we actually talk to each other. So please come and talk to us. Please come and engage in the subsequent 3 seminars that we're going to be running. I've just posted the link into the chat to sign up for the next seminar, which is, webinar, Get with the 2022 program, Civil Commercial Mutuals and the Fallout of Conflict. And a couple of housekeeping things. You can find events from both CIAB and JAMS on our website. And if you would like to view this recording, it'll be available on YouTube. So there you go.
And also we invite comments and observations. Don't forget, we want this to be a dialogue as well. So if you've got anything that you want to add, certainly feel free to either contact myself or Isabel or any of the individuals at JAMS or Chartered Institute. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, get in touch and we look forward to seeing you on the 4th of May.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
to everybody, including Michael and Sheila.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Isabel.